there's plenty going on in the U.S. and around the world affecting markets, both domestically and internationally. Here to talk more about that is Michael Greiner, an assistant professor of management at Oakland University School of Business Administration. Michael, thanks for being with us today.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me, and happy Friday.
Yes, happy Friday to you as well. Not so happy of a Fridays lately for former Green Bay Packers star Brett Favre, as he's made some pretty bad decisions allegedly over the last several years. So there's a big scandal going on where he had collected funds, allegedly had collected funds for charity, and then ended up that those funds were then forwarded to his alma mater, to his daughter's school, the University of Southern Mississippi, where she played volleyball to help promote their programs and build some of their programs up. And this is a huge scandal. Over $8 million was forwarded for those purposes when they were meant for an organization that helps affect the poor. Tell us a little bit more about this scandal and just how much fire Brett Favre is under and others are under, because this goes well beyond just the former quarterback.
Yeah, it sure does. And thanks for bringing this up, because this is really an outrage that I think everybody should really be bothered by. Brett Favre, of course, earned over $140 million playing football, and here he is basically taking money that was meant for poor people. And it's not just, you're right, that the most of it is aimed at essentially a grant to a university where his daughter attends and plays volleyball for a new volleyball stadium. And ironically, he was warned by the university president, as was the governor, that this was not a good source of money. That really what this came down to is Favre at one point had made a commitment that he was going to pay for the stadium. And instead of paying for it himself, he then went to the state and was able to procure these funds with the assistance of the governor and some other people in the leadership of the State House. So this really is a scandal. But as you say, it goes beyond that. He received more than just the $5 million. He also received $1.1 million, basically a check written directly to him for services that he never provided. He claims, of course, that he didn't know anything about where the source of these funds were, but there have been text messages that have been released that have showed that, in fact, he was very conscious of the fact that this wasn't quite kosher. And even if it wasn't something that he knew was coming directly from this fund in particular, he was aware that it wasn't quite legal, because at one point he texted the state administrator for the program asking, hey, is there any way they can find out where these funds are coming from? So he knew what was going on here. And each time he's made some type of excuse for his involvement, text messages have come out that have shown that really he knew what he was doing. He knew it was inappropriate, and he went ahead and did it anyway. So it's really outrageous. And in addition, of course, to the $1.1 million, which he has paid back, to give him credit for that, although he hasn't paid interest, which is demanded by the state, he also got investment into a company that he's a big investor in. So all these things seem so incongruous, especially where these are funds that, again, were meant for the poorest people in Mississippi, which is the poorest state in the country. Almost 28% of children in Mississippi live in poverty. And these are the funds exactly that would be aimed at helping these people. And instead, they're going to help Brett Favre essentially escape from an obligation he'd made to his alma mater. Quite disturbing. But the fact of the matter is, Favre is really just the most prominent face of this, as you point out. This goes much deeper. And in fact, there has been an audit that was done by an external auditing company, and they've said that as much as $77 to $94 million were spent inappropriately from this program. So Favre's $8 million, while significant, is still only one piece of this huge scandal. And some of the other people who are prominent who've received money include Ted DiBiase, who some may know as a wrestler, former professional wrestler, who is known as the $1 Million Man. Well, apparently the $1 million he gets is from the state. So it really, and there are all sorts of other, in fact, one individual who is in charge of the Department of Health and Human Services for the state has actually been convicted of a crime for his involvement in this. So this is not some minor thing. And ultimately, though, I think it goes back to a systematic problem here, which is that back in 1996, when this program was established, it's called Temporary Assistance for Needy Programs, or TANF. it replaced a federal program where the federal government would essentially step in and write checks to people who, were facing short-term financial problems. And essentially, as a result of some pressure from Congress, this program was changed from being a federally administered program to being a program where the federal government would give what are called block grants to the states, where each state could essentially take these funds and then spend them pretty much any way they want, as long as they were spent within certain parameters, which certainly these expenditures are outside of. But at any rate, the fact that these funds are given to the states and then they have so few checks and balances is really what has enabled this to happen. And I wouldn't be surprised, frankly, if we find out that other states are involved in similar things. Maybe not as scandalous as this one in particular, but certainly where we've seen inappropriate uses of funds that really should be going to helping people who are dealing with poverty.
And other public officials also are involved in this. As was reported previously by Ross Adams at WPT TV, ABC 16 in Jackson, Mississippi. The state's former Department of Human Services Executive Director John Davis also was implicated in this and actually pled guilty to charges with the state's $77 million welfare fraud scheme. That's where that was at that point in time, September 22nd, when this was reported. It was just at 77 million, and now it's, as Michael said, between 77 and $90 million in welfare fraud happening between these individuals. Also making news.
And I wouldn't be surprised if we see more charges, by the way. This is a huge scandal that is really only getting rolling here.
Yeah, it is. It's really just in its infancy, and we're only starting to see sort of some of these connections and the connections to connections. This could be a large-scale scheme that we haven't quite gotten the full scope of just yet. We're joined by Michael Greiner from Oakland University. He is an assistant professor of management at their School of Business Administration. Also making news that may affect many of our markets, particularly those in social media, is Elon Musk has now gone back to saying that in his efforts to buy Twitter, he is looking to go back to his original offer to buy Twitter, and that's really what he's adamant about. He's going to stick to that, and he still is intent on buying Twitter, even though, as had happened in previous months when this was first really making news, shortly after it seemed like he was backing out of this. How close is this sort of deal for Elon Musk to take over Twitter?
Well, I think this is definitely going to happen, and probably happen sooner rather than later. Frankly, when I first saw this report, I kind of had to laugh, because from the first day I heard the announcement, I predicted two things. Number one, that Musk was going to regret the offer and try to get out of it. Number two, that he was going to be forced to go through with the deal anyway. He signed a contract with Twitter, essentially making this offer for $44 billion. That's billion with a B. And in that contract, he basically did what's called waiving any kind of due diligence, where he said that he wasn't going to require them to provide him with any kind of documentation to justify his purchase or to back up any kind of claims that they've made. Instead, he was just saying he wanted to buy Twitter. I guess the best way to describe it is as is. And that's what the contract said. So later on, when he's suddenly claiming, there are these things that have come up that suddenly seem to be indicating that it's not such a good deal, especially in light of the fact that markets had dropped since he made his offer, which both reduced the value of Twitter and reduced his own wealth, which made it therefore that he'd have to spend a larger percentage of his own money in buying this company than he would have had to before. Suddenly he wants to get out of it, and he's claiming, that they're not showing him all the documentation that they're required to offer. But the point is, in the contract, he specifically had agreed they didn't need to show him anything. So at a certain point here, as I described to my students, a contract's a contract, and you're bound by a contract, whether it's a good deal, a bad deal, that you're allowed to make a bad deal and the courts will enforce it. And that's exactly what's going on here. I think that Musk realizes that the problems with Twitter are much more serious than he had anticipated, that fundamentally they come down to the fact that, frankly, People prefer Facebook and other social media platforms than Twitter. And as a result of that, Twitter has been struggling in getting the kind of advertising revenue that some of these others have had. And that's not the type of thing that him, with his all his celebrity status and all his claims of how he's going to change things, is really going to be able to do anything about. So the so my expectation is that Twitter is going to require, or at least request, that the court basically oversee this, so that he can't try to get out of this deal any more than he already has. Um, and and frankly, again, this is not a surprise to me. I think that the deal is going to go through, and if I were a betting man, I would say long run, I'd be betting against Twitter right now.
We're joined by Michael Greiner from Oakland University on today's edition of the Megacast. Michael, also making news that also involves the courts and will certainly affect the market in the months to come and in the years to come. Donald Trump, of course, under investigation for some of his alleged misuse of presidential records that he had also allegedly had with him in his home in Mar-a-Lago in Florida. And now he's asking the Supreme Court to intervene, particularly to protect certain parts of his personal information, including his finances and his presidential records. Just how you're an attorney, just how far along is this investigation, and what are some of the ways that this investigation should go further? Certainly, if charges are brought against the former president, how could that affect markets here in the U.S., especially as we approach 2024's election season very soon, just about a year away? We'll be talking about presidential candidates on both sides of the aisle.
Yeah, great questions. Thank you for bringing those up, Tyler. This is one of those situations where sometimes it's tough to see what's actually going on, because there's so much political rhetoric going on both sides. So basically, what had happened here is that you had Donald Trump take a bunch of documents with him from the White House when he left, and took them down to his home in Mar-a-Lago in Florida. And among those documents was at least 100 classified documents, essentially top secret documents, which reportedly have included things as sensitive as including nuclear secrets of the United States, as well as also the names and other identifying characteristics of some of the confidential sources of informants that we have in other countries, which you can imagine the value that information would have to some of our enemies, and even some of our allies, for that matter. So this is a very serious matter, and apparently the way that it was discovered originally is that the National Archives was looking through the documents that were at the White House after the president had left, and they discovered that certain documents that they knew about were missing. So they kept making requests to Donald Trump that he return these documents that had been taken. And despite numerous requests and despite some appearances of cooperating, each time it turned out that all the documents had not been returned. And in fact, we just heard yesterday that the National Archives is thinking that there are still documents out there that haven't been returned that could include some classified documents. So this is just an unbelievable situation. I don't understand how Donald Trump has caused this problem for himself. Why not just give back the documents? But at any rate, ultimately, after numerous requests, as we know, there was this search warrant that was issued where the FBI was able to go down and essentially look through Mar-a-Lago and find some of these documents. They found, as I said, over 100 classified documents, which have been returned since then. As at the same time, though, they also seized other documents. What the search warrant allowed is for them to seize not just classified documents and governmental documents, but the documents that those documents were essentially filed with, because of the fact that they wanted to show kind of the context of where these were and where these documents weren't being safeguarded in a way that you'd want our things like our nuclear secrets or espionage secrets to be kept. And so all those documents were taken. The FBI is undergoing a review of these documents. And after they have essentially completed the review, then Donald Trump's lawyers file a motion with a court in Florida, essentially asking the court to order this investigation to stop. And the basis that they're claiming is that some of those documents that were seized might be covered by what's called privilege, which means that it should be kept confidential even from the attorneys at the government. Now, the privilege that he's claiming are two kinds of privilege. One is attorney-client privilege, which is really the most sacred privilege we have here in the United States. People seem to think a lot of the time that there are things like, doctor-patient privilege or journalist interviewee privilege or penitent clergy privilege. And the fact of the matter is, legally, none of those privileges actually exist. The one privilege that does exist, though, is attorney-client privilege. And so courts are very sensitive to that. Another privilege, though, that exists, though, is the idea of executive privilege, which kind of speaks to the fact that we want the president and his advisors to be able to discuss serious matters of state in private and to consider different options without having all those options plastered across the front pages of the newspaper. That claim is problematic given the fact that Donald Trump, number one, is no longer president, and number two, that the Department of Justice is part of the executive. So to claim executive privilege when part of the executive is asking to see these documents is problematic. Nevertheless, the court in Florida granted the motion essentially to require someone called a special master, who's a former judge, to basically review all the documents and determine which of the documents are covered by privilege and to segregate those documents so that the Department of Justice doesn't include those in its investigation and its review. And as part of the order, the court ordered that any kind of review of the documents stop, which again, this was filed after the FBI had already completed its review of the documents, so it's kind of a weird situation here. But nevertheless, that's where we stood. The Department of Justice then appealed to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, which, in really a striking opinion, reversed the ruling of the district court judge. And it's important to note here, because I'm sure people are going to say, "Oh, politics this, politics that." Two of the three judges on that panel who reversed Judge Eileen Cannon's ruling in Florida were Trump appointees, actually. So these are people who did not owe anything to the Democrats or have any kind of axe to grind with Donald Trump. You have to give them credit that they were following the law. And the law really doesn't give any basis for withholding these top secret documents from the review of the Department of Justice. So subsequent to that, then, the special master, who actually was suggested by Donald Trump and then agreed to by the Department of Justice, started making some demands on Donald Trump. And as a result of that, then they've appealed to the Supreme Court. Now, there's a lot of talk about what this appeal involves. As it turns out, this appeal involves the narrowest of technicalities. The request is simply saying that Donald Trump and his attorneys are arguing that the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals did not have the authority, did not have the jurisdiction to essentially allow the Department of Justice to continue on with its review of the documents. That's the only issue that's before the Supreme Court right now. Now, you have to remember, the Supreme Court does not take all the cases that people request for it to take. It receives thousands of requests every year and hears less than 100 cases a year. So what they do is that they literally have to agree to hear the case. And what we call that is granting cert, or certiorari as a Latin term. Essentially what the court has to do is say, yes, this is an important enough issue for us to review it. And frankly, the way that the court has handled some of these requests from Donald Trump in the past, I don't think is going to give them a lot of hope that the Supreme Court is going to back him. Even though, yes, there is, people talk about, this 6-3 conservative majority on the Supreme Court. When it's come to requests by Donald Trump to essentially protect him from certain investigations or requests from documents, the Supreme Court has repeatedly basically batted down those requests. And I expect that's going to happen again. And probably what's going to happen is the Supreme Court is simply going to decline to hear the case. And as a result of that, the ruling by the 11th Circuit is going to stand and the investigation will go forward. Now, you ask a great question, which is how this will affect markets. The reality here, and this is kind of one of the most, I don't know if it's shocking or surprising, or I don't think anything should be shocking or surprising in this day and age, knowing our politics now, but seeing recent polling data, none of this has impacted Donald Trump's standing with his supporters in the Republican Party. So most of the research I've seen seems to indicate that if Donald Trump were to run for president, he would probably win the Republican nomination again. So that would that would create an interesting scenario where we see someone who was formerly defeated for president running for president again, now with all this burden of all these investigations following him. Some people might say that if he's convicted, he should not be able to run. In fact, the law is not clear on that. That he probably could still run, and so it's hard to imagine that he would not run if he intends to. And from everything I've heard and seen, it sounds like he does intend to. So that could certainly lead to a situation where markets get concerned about the fact that literally one of the two major candidates for president is under this kind of legal pressure. It could really cause markets to go even crazier than they have been over the last few years. So I think it's definitely something to watch out for in the long run.
Well, Michael, we appreciate your time and your insight on all these different issues. Certainly a lot going on in our world that's going to affect all areas of our life, both financially, economically, and politically going forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Happy to be here. Have a great weekend.